The presenting partner of today's episode is Sexton Speakers, Australia's leading speakers bureau. At Sexton, they know that the right speaker can be the most powerful part of any event, leaving a lasting impression that sticks with your audiences long after the final applause. With decades of experience, Sexton's team will match you with your perfect speaker, MC, or entertainer to elevate your event, delivering energy, insight, and inspiration like no else. Partner with Sexton and give your audience an experience they'll never forget.
We still think a leader is almost by default a man. In our society, it's a white man. And if they're tall, yep, that corresponds as well. It sounds absurd, but that's actually how a lot of us think about leaders still. So it's a bit of a, unfortunately, an awful cycle because it keeps getting reinforced.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change.
Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. My guest today is Catherine Fox, who is one of Australia's most respected journalists and authors on leadership and gender equity. A champion for women whose work has opened doors many of us once thought were welded shut. You will know her from her years of shaping the national conversation at the AFR and Boss magazine, where she widened the lens on what leadership looks like. Catherine does what the best journalists do. She follows the truth and refuses to look away. And when the data is uncomfortable, she sits us down and says, let's deal with it. Her book, Breaking the Boss Bias, is a clear call to stop pretending progress is unachievable and to change the systems that keep women out. Before that came Stop Fixing Women and 7 Myths About Women and Work. Each book redirects the spotlight from women's supposed shortcomings as structures that shape outcomes, targets, pay transparency, and leadership models that are not coded masculine by default. In our conversation, Catherine dismantles the tired myths about female leadership. The claims that women are risk-averse, indecisive, or less resilient do not stand up to evidence. We talk about the glass cliff, the pattern where women are handed the reins when risk is peaking. And we discuss what this reveals about comfort with accountability and how to change the conditions rather than the women. Catherine is precise about bias. It's not a villain we defeat once. It's a human shortcut that leaders must design around. That means setting guardrails in hiring, performance recognition and progression. Then tracking results so improvements stick. It also means naming the extra headwinds for women who do not fit the narrow template, including women of colour, and widening the frame of who is seen as credible. What I value most is how she links evidence to leadership practice. The strongest leaders she studies are deeply self-aware. They know their impact, they invite challenge, they correct course. That humility and clarity create teams that are safer and higher performing. Catherine is also generous with her platform. She champions diverse talent, backs initiatives that broaden who gets seen and heard, and keeps a close eye on how media chooses its authorities. She reminds boards that pay gaps do not close themselves and encourages men to shift from ally to accomplice. This is a deeply personal conversation about fairness, power, and the discipline of leading well. Please enjoy my conversation with the incredible Catherine Fox. Well, hello, Catherine. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. How are you today?
I'm okay, thank you, and thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. You are an award-winning journalist, author, and one of Australia's most respected voices on gender equity and leadership. I'd like to find out or understand what drew you into this space from the very beginning? Have you always wanted to be in this space?
It's an interesting question, which I have been asked over the years. A friend of mine said one day with a laugh, I think you were a feminist in utero. I don't think that's quite the case, but my interest, I guess, in fairness, and I should just hasten to add, I would hate to think anyone to think my family environment was unfair or that the women in my family were not fantastically brilliant and very independent in their own right. They were. But I suspect even from an early age, being brought up in a quite Catholic family, it was just really clear to me, the people in my environment and my community who had standing, the avenues that were almost by default denied to women. And of course, I'm incredibly privileged and I acknowledge that immediately. And my generation was kind of the first generation that went to university en masse as women. So I've had so many incredible, fortunate breaks in my life. But I think it just was something to do with really being irritated by people being unfairly left out, having opportunities denied them, and the terrible waste that comes from that. So it just was something that built over time. And I had some remarkable women in my family, and I would look at them and think, goodness, imagine what you could have done if the
Yeah.
times had been different, including my gorgeous mother. And so, and she was the first to say, go to university, get a degree, get your own work, get your own money. So I think for me, all of that combined gave me a real interest and passion for equity.
I'm interested to know from your perspective, there's a generation of women who, fought the battle, took the risks, made the sacrifice. And I look at this next generation of women now coming through, and many of the doors have been opened because of what the previous generation did. Do you think we've lost a bit of the will to fight or the passion to fight?
Well, I don't think so, actually. And the reason I say that is my book, Breaking the Boss Bias, came out towards the end of last year. Unfortunately, I was quite unwell. So I'm sort of on the hustings at the moment, a bit more actively. And fortunately, in a way, because I'm not, of course, I'm not happy to see what's happening around DEI backlash from the US, but the whole point of my book has become even more pronounced, and it's a book for the times. So I'm talking to a lot of audiences, and if anything, I would say that passion and that fervor is starting to be reignited, especially with younger women. And that I find incredibly uplifting. I'm quite optimistic. I've got three daughters, so it's easy for me to see within my own family a real, not just a commitment, but an expectation that they will have a different life than the one I even had, but that they will be treated with respect. And I do think that that's incredibly important. And while I am again talking about a fairly privileged cohort, I see that from women from all kinds of backgrounds and younger women in particular, the young women from migrant backgrounds, the young women who are being marginalized through other areas. I see them saying, no, this is not good enough. And I am, buoyed by that. So I think actually because we're going through a period of backlash, I think they are lifting their game.
Now, you've spent years reporting on structural workplace barriers. What continues to frustrate you about the pace of change?
I think what's frustrating is that it is completely viable to change some of these structures, some of these processes, in fact. And there's so many examples. In fact, in Breaking the Boss Bias, I go through a few case studies to intervene, to change, to short circuit rather biased processes, particularly around recruitment and progression within organisations, where women are employed, how they're recognised and rewarded. And there's just so many tools available and they're highly effective. So I think my frustration remains, I'm quite a practical person. And I think that some of the inertia we've had is because there hasn't been a judicious use of some of these tools and a tracking of their results. So I think there's been a rather slapdash approach, and therefore we haven't seen the reinforcement when you actually get good results. And I think if organisations did that and did it in a sustained strategic way, they would find those results and there would be less resistance. So I find that frustrating because another part of the conversation at the moment, or the backlash, is, oh, we've wasted so much time and money on diversity programs and now men are being left out. Well, both of those things are not true. Certainly in the Australian context. And we have data to show that's the case.
It's not true. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's my big frustration.
So you've written Breaking the Boss Bias. You've also written Stop Fixing Women. And in Stop Fixing Women, you challenge the idea that women need to change to succeed. What are some of the most persistent myths you have set out to dismantle in that book?
Well, the persistent myths that I was tackling in fact, in all my books, because this is
It's a theme.
book, six. So I think that I've co-written a number of books as well, but 7 myths about women in work. Do you know, I was tackling the same ideas and they're pervasive still. So I was at pains in the latest book to point out some of the skills women have around the areas we are classically told we are poor or deficient in. Decision making, an absolutely core part of leadership, of course. There's no data to show that women are poor at decision making, that they're risk averse, they're not good at negotiating, that they crumble under pressure. In fact, I think we have really good examples of the opposite. And I think that there's a handful of them and they keep coming up. And the one that really annoys me, there's so many things that annoy me, but the one that really annoys me is that they lack confidence. And so much of that is based on behaviour in certain contexts and where women maybe are not putting their hand up and not speaking up for very practical reasons because they get penalised when they do. But we've unfortunately come back into this well-worn groove of blaming women. So as I point out in the book, one of the reasons I wrote it, we've kind of gone backwards in those very senior decision-making roles, albeit with some extraordinary women in some leading positions in Australia. To their utter credit, we have a woman, of course, running the Reserve Bank, Qantas, Telstra, Woolworths, Coles, and they're all remarkable and should put paid to a whole lot of this mythology, by the way. But they are still the exceptions and not the
Not
rule.
the rule.
And yeah, and if we look across the statistics, we've seen a gradual slide backwards, quite small in some cases, but it shouldn't be going backwards at all. Around the world, there are fewer women running governments than there were just a few years ago. And this is also playing out in the business world. I know in the FTSE 100, I think 9% of CEOs are women, very similar in the US. So this is not me making this up. We're actually seeing fewer women in those decision-making roles. So I think that handful of tenacious ideas that women are not up to leadership, that they're not good in those areas, that they're born, that they're biologically without some of those skills, needs to be recalibrated and readdressed.
Yeah. And you kind of wonder where it started because I think every woman has the same rhetoric thrown at them when they take on leadership positions. There's a list, and the list is the same no matter whether you were in leadership 20 years ago or you are today. The list has not changed. And you're right, it just has to stop.
And it's very handy, isn't it? Because you can just say, oh, she's not up to that. She's not up to it. And can I also add here, it's really important to talk about intersectionality here because combined with racism, that stuff is utterly toxic. It's bad enough. But when it comes to people who are marginalised because of their racial background or indeed other forms of marginalisation with a whole lot of mythology, oh, she's not assertive enough, she's too evasive, she's not innovative and so on. These things are incredible. And of course, for men as well, who do not fit into a certain mold, again, we find the same dynamic. So if you think about it, and I was at pains to talk about what we think of as a leader and how we keep recycling the same ideas about leadership in the book. And I even spoke to someone at Harvard at the business school, and what we teach about leadership, it's incredibly narrow.
One of the brands you mentioned, the female CEO at Qantas, I want to use the example of the glass cliff positions because when she was appointed, that was the first thing that went through my head. It also happens in politics. Julia Gillard is probably the perfect example of that, where the likelihood of success is low. I'm interested to know your thoughts on why do women take up those positions knowing that the chances of success is low and that they're actually taking up a shitstorm of an environment when they take on that role?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, I suspect a lot of them don't. By the way, we only know the ones who do. Okay.
True.
I suspect actually because I know women who've been offered jobs and thought, no way, I know where this is going. The ones who do, why does anyone take a position of power? Men step into jobs at fragile and turbulent times as well, of course. I think if you've worked all your life to get up the pole, and no matter what if you're in politics or in the corporate world, there's upheaval and someone says, well, you could do it. I think we're all the same. We probably think I am more than my gender.
Mhm.
I will be assessed on what I do and my qualities that I bring to this job. And therefore they think, and I understand that, they think I can probably do some good here. I think I can do this job. Yes, I know the Glasscliff research, but I think maybe I can step in and actually perform here. And of course, in a way, they should be right. It shouldn't be a case of being damned by your gender or indeed any other factor like that. But statistically, again, that Glasscliff research is so rigorous. But I think you would find Michelle Ryan, who of course was one of the architects of it, and now luckily for us is at ANU running the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here. She would say it's not completely consistent. It is overwhelmingly the case, but there are exceptions to the rule. And Vanessa Hudson, the CEO of Qantas, I was concerned about that, remembering I was writing the book nearly 2 years ago. But I was concerned at the time. Well, she's still there.
Yeah,
Qantas is
and she's doing
facing
it. She's
incredible. Yep,
yes.
but she is absolutely. And there is that body, that cohort of women now running some of our large listed companies. I would like to think that takes a little bit of the pressure off some of those women who are often the only one. We'd have the head of Macquarie Bank and one other, but there's a cohort now, and we all know that makes a difference. That critical mass theory. So not just having one woman running a large listed company, we've got several. So maybe gender kind of recedes and we stop judging them in an unfair way. But I have no data to back that up, but it just strikes me that there's such a larger group doing that at the moment, which we're very lucky to have. So maybe that's taken some of that pressure off. And Vanessa Hudson is still the CEO.
Yeah, and she's doing a great job. You mentioned earlier about the lack of diversity in the workplace. And, given that we have 50% of our population now is either migrant background, migrated here or born here, we're still not seeing that reflected in leadership roles. How do you think, men or women, how do you think we could change that?
Well, that's an understatement. The statistics are appalling, actually, utterly appalling when you think of how many
Well,
people in
50,
our
yeah.
population. Yeah, plus the number pouring out of our universities with fantastic degrees and ready to. I see them every year. I do an event for International Women's Day with a group called Capital W, and it's women from our leading universities who are all studying economics, law, finance. And they put this event on every year, and 200 of them turn up. And I just look out, and that is one of the most diverse groups I will speak to for my entire year. So, what am I looking at the rest of the time? With the more senior cohorts, it's white men. And well, for me, obviously, it's a lot of women, but it's still not as diverse. So, the further up the hierarchy you go, the less there is that diversity. And I think that's appalling. And again, a massive waste. And one of the things I've been really grateful to be able to be involved in the last few years, Julie Chai, a friend of mine, set up the Asian Leadership Project. And she did ask me to help her. And I said, but Julie, look at me. And she said, I want your platform, Catherine. And I said, right, that I can provide you with. So I do help out whenever I can, but I'm so privileged to see and hear the conversations at the events and forums and workshops that she runs. And it's not a flattering picture of our society. So this is men and women, and to be blunt, the racism that they are still confronting is awful. And it is, again, not doing our country any favours. These are people who've been born here, educated here, and we should be utilising them. Of course we should. So it's painful. And I think a friend of mine is also looking at board representation across a number of those groups, and it's very low. I think it's around 4%. 4% on listed company boards, those top boards who come from a non-Caucasian background. And that's simply not good enough.
Do you think we need to start bringing in quotas around some of these sorts of things? It's a conversation I've had with many women around many lunches and dinners with a glass of wine around, and I've never been in favour of them. But then when you start looking at some of the numbers and how slow the pace of change is, do we speed it up by, putting some numbers around this? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I've been completely consistent. If you are serious about this, you must have targets. I don't mind what you call them. Look at what's happened with the two, I was going to say major parties, barely a major party now, the LNP. However, that resistance to having any kind of affirmative action to get more women to stand in winnable seats, which is something the Labor Party adopted a long time ago, there's a living example in front of us. And by the way, something I often point out, and friends of mine often say, we have quotas all the time and targets.
True.
But not around gender, right?
Yeah.
We say, oh, we've got this group we're bringing together, maybe in the business context, or we better have someone from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, geographic. We have, oh, we need this expertise. Let's make sure. We do it all the time, and no one bats an eyelid. And they don't say, oh, that's unfair. What we're saying is, to make it fair, we have to remind ourselves that we have to have a suitable representation on a number of levels. So the one qualifier that I'd add around targets, again, having poured through data and interviewed academics about this, if you're going to do it consistently and do it properly. Don't just suddenly impose them, get one person and plunge them into a group. That's not going to work. And in fact, there can be backlash. So it is very important. And I go into this in some detail in the book. There's a wonderful academic at University of South Australia who writes about this. And she's looked at the public service and she said, when you have someone who's not sympathetic to targets, who reluctantly puts them in place, they actually backfire. So they do have to be properly implemented, measured, and consistent.
And for the long term and
long term.
Yeah. The gender pay gap report that came out last year now, it came out, wasn't it? Or no, earlier this year in February it came out, sorry. It shows some of the largest companies with their pay gaps, which was, in some ways surprising, in some ways not surprising. And in many ways it shows that despite the rhetoric we hear about it, we probably aren't making as much of a progress as we should be. Why do you think this is?
Well, that's why I wrote the book. To be absolutely clear, the reason is that men are massively overrepresented in highly paid and / powerful jobs in many of our larger employers, and not, all the employers who are covered by that data. And just to put that in context, it started last year that this was published by employer. So we've always, the agency, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's always gathered gender pay gap data, but they would only publish by sector. And then some amendments to the legislation allowed them to publish by employer. And it was something that the UK did a number of years ago. And it's made quite a difference because there's nothing like having the name of your company
Business
up there with a significant gender pay gap.
And what I noticed also, some of the companies had the ability to actually put some blurb around why the gap existed, which was really interesting to read.
Very interesting to read. Although I did have a chuckle when a number of them said, oh, but this is just because we have more men in high-paid jobs. Yes, exactly right. And I do think, and Mary Wooldridge from the agency said the same thing. Nobody expected it to be an instant cure. But what it does is it does tend to make people focus their minds, because that is exactly what's happening. So if that is the case, and you're an employer and you have a lot of women working for you, and you even have them up to a relatively senior, sort of mid-management level, but they're not making it through into those senior levels, what's happening? So that is indeed correct. I thought this year's was, again, fascinating. And I thought the fact that, of course, it's the higher paid sectors that have the widest pay gap. Well, I've known that for years, because being a business journalist, I would look at the financial services sector, which employs, I think, probably over 50% women, but they are clustered in the lower paid, lower skilled jobs generally. So I think that this is a very useful tool. I think transparency is paramount, and especially when it comes to pay. So there's a wonderful example from a few years ago from the BBC, where but under their charter, they had to publish data around pay, probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And it turned out their China correspondent, Carrie Gracie, who was incredibly experienced, was paid 50% less than her male peers. It's a huge scandal in the UK. So I think that elevating these as examples and saying you might think that everything's okay. And the other point I would make about the gender pay gap, quoting actually Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz, who used to run Mirvac, of course, she said they had to do it every year. They had to look every single year. It's not a set and forget. You think that you've changed some of the dynamics, but no, you have to go back every year to look at that and ensure that the pay gap is not once again creeping up.
And
So
boards play a real big role in that sort of direction and conversation, don't they?
yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, oh, without a doubt. Yeah,
Mm,
have
mm.
to. And I think we have made changes, and of course we do have equal pay legislation.
Yeah, well,
It is no longer, and I think it is. It's not. It does happen, but I think equal pay for equal work is a fairly well recognised principle. But I'm just going to throw a slight spanner in the works because I was asked this at a forum recently, and a woman quoted that academic Carol Kulik from University of SA, who said, sadly, the more people know about the pay gap and why it occurs, because it's very sectoral as well, as I've explained, financial services, but it still exists in areas of care and service sectors as well, which are female dominated. She said the more they know about it, the more they accept it. And I remember her saying that to me, and this was her well, not her thinking, her analysis was, we just assume that if you're a woman working in a female dominated area, you're a nurse, you've made a choice and you've gone to a lower paid area because you have domestic responsibility and caring responsibility. Now, isn't that interesting? Well, I
wow.
think we can all rationalize things. And I
Yeah,
think that when she said that to me, I remember being a little bit, and then I thought, I see what you mean. Because again, I've heard men in large corporates saying the same thing. Oh,
yeah.
we would have loved to have promoted her, but she didn't want to. She really didn't want the top job. And it's really interesting. So it's again where our biases
Mm.
and assumptions come in.
I want to switch to media because you've often highlighted the fact that the default authority quote is often male in the media world. Do you see that changing in more recent times?
Look, it has changed. Perhaps not quite as much as I'd like it to, but it has changed. I've been using the example of women economists, for example, but again, because of my finance reporting background, but a real concerted effort by women in economics has really lifted the profile of a number of incredible women economists.
Mm,
And I have to say, places like the ABC also very intentionally would say, okay, let's have a woman economist quoted on the latest interest rate hike. And I think that's really tangible because when I mention it, particularly to many of the audience I speak, I'll say, think of the last time that did happen.
mm,
Did you see a woman? And most people, yeah, actually. Yep, you're right. So a few years ago, it was men in grey suits, pretty
mm,
much shoulder to shoulder, who were reported on at those occasions. So I think that, again, it requires effort, but women in media that I work with a bit, we're keeping very close eye on this. And the areas I tell you where we still have a preponderance of men is interesting politics and business, so finance.
mm.
So there's still a way to go. And understanding kind of the way news is gathered and newsroom dynamics. I noticed for years when I'd say to colleagues, here's a woman, she's great. It's a question of actually being kind of persistent on that and making sure that contacts do include a broader group of people. But it's slow, but I do see signs that things are changing. Yeah.
Did it impact your career at a time when perhaps it was more prevalent?
In a sense, no, in that I was the one who was able to quote a lot of women. So, because remember, I was writing about leadership
Mm,
and
true.
management for Boss magazine for a long time. And one of the things that we worked out, I mean, it's pretty blindingly obvious. If you are going to say, well, we will only profile CEOs of larger companies in Australia, you're going to end up with a quite small cohort, generally speaking. So I'm talking when I was back in the newsroom. So we always looked out for different kinds of talent and people that we could interview because they're incredible academics, by the way. There's great specialists. And also we would sometimes think, well, who's in that 2IC or that sort of exco level in a company who could be a bit of a rising star? So there are different ways of casting the net and understanding that you don't just have to hone in on the CEO. Important though, of course, they are, but you need to look a little bit more, be a little more creative and understand a little bit more about how you change that. So I think it was always a bit of an ask to find women, but as we went on, we found more and more.
Yeah.
And, there's a quote in the book from Catherine Shine from WA, she's an academic, and she said, her research showed you can find women who are expert in almost anything if you try. And she's quite right.
True.
It is absolutely the case, but it is about being intentional about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I like that. It is very much about being intentional. And all businesses and all leaders need to be very intentional about whether you want more women, a more diverse environment, not just for now, but for the future as well. Right now, we have to make very intentional decisions around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've spoken about coded masculinity in leadership norms. Tell me more about that, and how do we start to dismantle that?
I think that it was interesting for me to go back. So I left the Fin Review in 2012, end of 2012. So it's quite a while since I've been in that mainstream leadership reporting and writing space, but obviously kept in touch with it over the years. But to go back and look at where we were, so what were the leadership styles that were, and in fact, leadership theories, kind of the gurus and so on, what were business schools
They were
talking
all
about?
male. They were all
They're
male.
all men. And I mentioned talking to someone from Harvard. I was looking at Harvard Business School case studies, which are ubiquitous. They're used all over the world. And I think it was something over 90% of them were case studies of organizations run by white, middle-aged American men. So that has barely shifted. And that I thought was very worrying. Obviously, I spoke to a number of academics, and I know, by the way, there are business schools which are onto this. INSEAD is one where they're looking very differently. Harvard Business School, they said, yes, we need to change this. It is true. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but it hasn't shifted in a way that I possibly would have predicted about 10 or 11 years ago. I would have thought, oh, come on. And I should know, really, because generational change is not to be relied on. I've heard that for 30 years. A new generation will have a different attitude. It's incredible how tenacious some of these ideas are about who should be a leader, what they look like. I mean, you've read, I'm sure, Malcolm Gladwell's Tall Men, connection. So we still think a leader is almost by default a man. In our society, it's a white man. And if they're tall, yep, that corresponds as well. It sounds absurd, but that's actually how a lot of us think about leaders still. So it's a bit of a, unfortunately, an awful cycle because it keeps getting reinforced. And that's why I'm really hopeful that we can shift that. Because it's not only about gender. Of course, that's one of my great concerns. It's about a different style of leading.
Leadership, yeah.
Absolutely. Why does it have to be packaged up in one style? Clearly, that's for starters. But it's the approach to leadership, the fact that it has to be one person sitting on the top of a pyramid, for example, which is why I went to some pains to talk about job sharing, even in senior roles. Just we need different ways of leading. And I think a younger generation is expecting that, especially in places like startups and the IT world. I think they're not the big Silicon Valley monsters, but I think the smaller organizations are expecting different styles.
I'm seeing that particularly with the younger generation, particularly in startups, and a lot in, the tech arena as well. They have a very different view of leadership and the world to a lot of other businesses. And you're right, it'll start at a small ground level somewhere and it'll just seep through, into every business at some point.
Yes, and I think for so many years we said, no, you've got to have one person making the decision. No, you don't. I just keep saying, Dad, what happens in your family?
Yes.
Just one person? Because seriously, where I've seen that, the marriage has not lasted, or the association has not lasted. It's actually not how we run things. It's not. And you probably saw the references to that wonderful book, The Patriarchs by Angela Saini. Brilliant book. And I've met Angela. She's just extraordinary. Her point is patriarchy. We've been sold this idea patriarchy has been the be all and end all forever. Not true. Actually, we've had very good examples through history, right back to prehistoric times of collaborative, communal ways of living where there was not one powerful figurehead. And by the way, some of those powerful figureheads were women, but because of sexism, they weren't even identified.
They weren't identified.
It's just fascinating. It's a tangent and I won't go any further into it, but just to think differently about the most effective way of running things would be great.
Many years ago, the concept of male champions of change came up, and then we moved into male allyship and sponsorship and mentoring into business. What are your thoughts on that power sharing opportunities that exist for both men and women? And is it really being played out in the way that it should be?
Oh, look, I think Champions of Change was a really well-intentioned, interesting idea. And I think on paper, it made so much sense. And I think they've done some good. I don't think it's been quite as effective, possibly as anyone would hope. but nothing's perfect. And I think that it did focus some of the minds around the table, but I think the outcomes have been up and down. It's not been completely positive. I don't think it's been, having said that, I should say, I don't think it's been negative. I don't think there's been a really massive downside. I think expectations were probably quite high. But I think the idea of, because I've spoken to a number of champions of change over the years, and one of the things they would all say is that they have learnt from each other. And I do think that idea of sitting down, even though you may well be very intense business rivals, but saying, well, we did this and that worked really well for us. I think there's truly some value in that, and I think that that's happened. I think that I've always said, even with areas like Lean In, the Sheryl Sandberg book and Lean In circles and so on, which I've been openly critical of, but I still think on balance, is it better to have someone highlighting some of this stuff? Well, yeah, probably it is. And I always said about Sheryl Sandberg, because it's not personal, that she didn't have to do that. It was something that she did care about and she wanted to write about. I just think the approach was, based on some sort of really kind of inaccurate ideas about how women behave. But there you go. She did at least put her hand up and say, I'm going to write about this and talk about it. So I would say that we learn from these things too, and that we understand a bit more. What I guess is upsetting to me is that I thought we would have gone much further by this stage. So I think that while all of those efforts and various others within organisations have been there, they haven't been, as we've said a number of times now, consistent and strategic. I just don't see many examples of that, which is why I think the fact we're facing now a backlash, it's not like we went that far in the first place.
No, that's right. The rise of AI, which is really shifting how we lead and run businesses and manage people. What do you see as the next frontier around the workplace equity with the impact that AI is eventually going to have?
I'm no expert, so I will just give you a little bit of a reading from what I'm observing, mainly actually from the women in media, insights that they gather. Quite a lot of the women we survey in the sector, and of course, remembering they work in all parts of media, so some advertising, they work in podcasting, they work in, they're not all journalists by any means, but broad catchment, and they are seeing AI have an impact. Look, quite a lot of them will say, I use AI, and it's of help to me. What concerns them is what will happen to jobs. And I think for women in a sector like media, where certainly mainstream media is in such a state of turbulence and is constantly shrinking, I think it's a real concern for some of them. So while they can appreciate that it has some huge benefits, and I think the long-term forecasts from people who know a bit more about this is it will settle down. It won't take wholesale jobs out of the offing. But I don't know. What I hear just at the moment from women in that sector is, yes, some concern that it may have an impact on jobs for them.
If you had the opportunity to mentor all the women listening to this podcast right now, who are either leading or emerging or thinking about leading, what would your advice be to them?
My main one is, please realise you've been gaslit for years. Okay? You've been told you're making sexism up. It doesn't exist, that you're dramatising, possibly slightly hysterically, what goes on in meetings, the fact that you've missed out on, once again, a promotion when the fairly mediocre bloke next to you has got another one. Please understand, you're not making it up. Obviously, feel obliged to tell you, read my latest book, but the data around this is very clear-cut. Sadly, sexism and bias is still a reality. What that gaslighting does to you is put you on the back foot, prevents you from taking a bit of control and working out. I mean, not all of you, clearly, and I thoroughly endorse all of you who are out there trying to change this. But what I am at pains to say to women is, it is not your fault. You did not invent sexism. Why would you? And really, it is to understand that, take that burden off your shoulders, that you made the wrong decision. It was your fault. It's you to blame. And that's why I wrote Stop Fixing Women. But I felt it was timely to refresh this, because we've gone into overdrive. Well, in fact, before the latest, Trumpism, on this progress idea that we're actually, the momentum's there and that we are moving inexorably to gender equity. That's actually not what I'm seeing. And sadly, I know most of you already have a long to-do list, but we have to be on our guard and making sure that we do not let ourselves slide backwards. I mean, on the upside, I am an optimist. I don't think in a country like this, where we've had education for so long and our reproductive rights to date have been protected. Those are two absolute fundamentals. I don't think we're about to go backwards in a substantial way, but I do think in the world of work, paid work, but also unpaid work, we're real laggards, actually. 2/3 of it sitting on women's shoulders in this country, barely shifted in 20 years. So you're not making it up. Many of us are in the same boat. Join together to resist and push back.
And what would you say to the men?
Be helpful, really. Just, I saw someone saying the other day, don't talk about allies, talk about accomplices. And I really like that
I
word.
like that.
Be an accomplice. Get in there and be intentional. Help women, amplify what they're doing. Work together to see better equity. No matter what kind of equity it is, be active around it. I think we like to think we're plain speaking in Australia, but I think we're very averse to conflict. And I think particularly with men, they get ridiculed. Oh, mate, what do you want about, mate? I think there's lots of pushback, cultural pushback. So I would urge men to sort of see that for what it is. The research on this shows that men tend to exaggerate the sexism of their male peers. So actually, a lot of the blokes around you probably feel like, yeah, this is a little unfair. So stand up and stand with, shoulder to shoulder, your colleagues, because it is going to be better for everyone in the end.
So let's talk about your book, because that
Yep.
is out, your latest book. Tell us more about that, and why did you write it?
Well, as I've said, I wrote it because of all those factors. I felt like we were facing a period of backlash, yet we were telling ourselves this progress story. And I'm not just saying that or plucking it out of my brain. A huge study, gender compass study, about 18 months ago, picked up 60% of Australians believed we were either at gender equity or close to it. 60%. Regardless, as we've already discussed, of the gender pay gap statistics, the really, dire number of women in senior leadership and so on. So that I find disturbing. If you think you're already on the way, then you really don't try
You
hard
don't, yeah.
because you think it's inevitable. It's happening already. We have the structures in place to keep progress going. But the other factor, of course, was the one I've just outlined. It's the gaslighting, because I was hearing women saying, oh, I didn't try hard enough. I've been told it's all on merit. That word kept coming up again. I missed out because I wasn't confident enough. So I was hearing worrying. These were red flags to me. These are worrying themes that were coming up again. And I thought, just as we need to sort of double down, we're going through this period of inertia and a lot of gender washing, or what's known as gender washing. So we have some great legislative frameworks in this country. In fact, we've got more now. We've got Respect at Work and then the latest legislation that's gone through around reporting on targets. But there are many ways to tick a box, but not to be making actual change and progress, particularly when it comes to those power ranks. And by the way, the latest book is not all about the corporate world and those sort of, towers in the city. It's about leadership at all levels, women being valued and appreciated for what they bring to the table. So I have cast the net very widely. It's across community groups, it's across small businesses, it's across startups and so on. Why are there not more women actually calling the shots and making a difference?
Breaking the Boss Bars is out in all good bookstores or all bookstores, or I'm assuming you can get it online,
Yes,
digital copy as well.
Yep.
Now, we've come to the spot in our podcast where we ask all of our guests our 4 key questions about what they see as the future of leadership. So if you had to describe a future fit leader in just 3 words, the kind of leader we'll need most in the years ahead, what would they be and why?
I'm going to go off-piste here. So
Okay, you're going to give me 4 words?
No, not even that. I'm going to not quite answer that because I think I have spent so long looking at this entire topic, interviewing the gurus, talking about leadership theories, all the stuff that I've explained is also in the book, that I just wanted to pass something on, which people will say, oh, well, that's no help, but I actually think there's no formula. Actually is not one. And that was as I looked into and researched these, leadership case studies and so on, which are overwhelmingly of white American men and so on, this is based on this idea that if we follow a Steve Jobs or I can't say Elon Musk, or somebody well known, that we will therefore become leaders, or we can equate those qualities or whatever. That's not how it works, actually. And in fact, we know that sometimes very unlikely people Very unlikely are fantastic leaders. Yes, they will share some characteristics, I guess, but very broad characteristics. And I just wanted to say that's why, though, I think when we stick to formulas or ideas, or you didn't do this at this point in your life and therefore you can't do that, gosh, we restrict ourselves and people cancel out. They say, I'm not in the running, I couldn't do that. And because we actively do that in our society around women, and particularly, can I say, at this stage of my life, older women, at a point where men are often at their peak powers, and older women are just invisible or dismissed, and their value scarcely recognised. In fact, it's negative usually. I just want to be absolutely clear. If we knew there was a formula for great leadership,
We'd all
clearly
be doing it.
we'd all be doing it. So I'm not saying you shouldn't seek enlightenment, read widely, read my books. Absolutely, please. But understanding yourself and then understanding that you cannot adhere to a set of rules to become a leader. And the only other one that I was going to have gone way over time is when I was writing for the magazine, and we had some wonderful people I worked with around this, and we used to just say, and we were writing about leadership day in, day out, it's really hard to summarize it, but you know it when you see it.
When you see it, I love it.
Yep.
What's the one future shift coming in the next few years that you think most leaders are underestimating or not prepared for?
I think it's the younger generation's expectations. What do they expect? Who do they expect to be running things? And do they continue to want one person running something? Or are they actually the generation that will say, well, of course you can have three people sharing leadership or running something. In fact, isn't that how Atlassian started up and Canva and
True.
are they going to have a completely different set of expectations about what leadership looks like? I sincerely hope so.
I hope so too, and it really excites me to think that in 5 to 10 years it'll be very different. So what do you wish more leaders were paying closer attention to?
Their biases, without a doubt. We all have them. I absolutely have them. We all have them. It's a bit sad that all that unconscious bias training, actually, we know now,
Doesn't
didn't
work?
exactly. Well, no, I mean, the sad reality is, I think some of it was quite worthwhile. Again, a 1 hour workshop is not going to change anyone. But what we do know is when it's done once over lightly, it actually confirms people's biases because they understand they have them, but they think everyone has them. There's nothing I can do about that. Aren't we interesting creatures, humans? So I think that understanding genuinely that you will be bringing those blinkers to the table and doing whatever you can to ensure. That's why diversity around the table, the decision-making table, is so important. And someone will bring something up you haven't even thought about.
Sort of.
The unknowns.
Yeah.
So I think that understanding that is something we all fall into, it, affinity bias, all those kinds of biases, and making sure that you have taken steps to, as much as you can, mitigate that.
What are the possibilities or shifts you see in the future of leadership or work that genuinely excites you?
Oh, the one that I think is fantastic, and of course is topical, is the genuine idea of flexibility. So working from home, sure, or remote working, I think it has to be calibrated correctly. You can't just be wholesale. But I think a younger generation is now expecting it. And in a country like Australia, which tends to suffer from talent shortages, not the opposite, I think that's massive. So even though we're seeing tussles, and this came up in the election campaign, I think overwhelmingly we know that that's important. It's important for men and women, but particularly for women. So there's quite a lot of data showing that for women, it's absolutely essential for some of them, and that it does mean that they can have tenure in their jobs, which has so many repercussions. So for progression, for pay, for retirement savings. So there's a whole lot of areas around being genuinely flexible that really excites me. I don't think it's going away. And I know that there are some CEOs saying they're going to mandate.
Good luck.
Good luck with that. I think that's a permanent shift.
Yeah. If you could embed one leadership quality into every current or future CEO, something you think will be essential in the next decade, what would it be and why?
I've mentioned being aware of your biases. The best leaders that I've observed, interviewed, or heard spoken of are genuinely self-aware, really self-aware. So in other words, they're not sitting there surrounded by sycophants.
Yes, people.
Yes, people. They're really they are properly self-aware. They can take criticism. Not an easy thing for anybody to take. And when I say criticism, just even maybe try this a different way, and they accept that. There's a certain amount of humility around that as well. But I think genuine self-awareness often comes hand in hand with curiosity too. So not being blinkered, not being, I know everything, which is, this is the problem with having this old-fashioned top of the pyramid style. You're constantly reinforced in that I know the way forward, my way or the highway. And there's so many historical examples of why that doesn't work. So it's, I think if we could have a bit more of that, it'd be great.
Catherine, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And personally, thank you for all the work that you have done in the space of women's gender equality, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I've been really privileged to have 40 minutes of your time today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and allowing me to talk about some of my favourite topics.
And just another reminder, Breaking the Boss Bias is out and very much worth a read for everybody.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.